All right, so I want to read from this book by Dr. Harriet Lerner. It's called Why Won't You Apologize? Healing Big Betrayals and Everyday Hurts. And I listened to her 2-part podcast with Brene Brown, and it is so phenomenal and so needed because I actually needed to apologize. I needed to do some repair work in a handful of relationships. And so this is like hallelujah, this is here because I wasn't as perfect as I wanted to be, and I really messed up. And in those situations, I was really worried that our relationship would be over. And then a friend of mine reminded me about repair work and just how, that when we mess up, sometimes it gives us the opportunity to do some repair work inside the relationship, and it can create an opportunity for the relationship to just actually get so much deeper. So I wanted to read from chapter 1 in Dr. Harriet Lerner's book, and it's titled The Many Faces of I'm Sorry. My humorist friend, Jennifer Berman, drew a cartoon of the guy with a million excuses. My personal favorite is, I'm sorry, but you never asked me if I was married with kids. Then there's the New Yorker cartoon that shows a father talking to his grown son. I wanted to be there for you growing up. I really did, the dad says, but I got a foot cramp and then a thing came up at the store. Anyway, you understand. While the humor of both cartoons rests on their absurdity, we have all received apologies followed by rationalizations that undo them. They are never satisfying, and in fact, they do considerable harm. I've been studying apologies and the men and women who can't give them for over 2 decades. Of course, you don't need to be an expert on the subject to recognize when a well-deserved apology is not forthcoming or when a bad apology flattens you. I'm sorry won't cut it if it's insincere, a quick way to get out of a difficult conversation, or followed by a justification or an excuse. The healing power of a good apology is also immediately recognizable. When someone offers me a genuine apology, I feel relieved and soothed, and whatever anger and resentment I may still be harboring melts away. I also feel better when I offer an apology I know is due. I'm enormously grateful that I can repair the disconnection after having made a mistake or acted badly. Not that I've always been a champion apologizer. With my husband, Steve, for example, I like to apologize for exactly my share of the problem, as I calculated, of course. So in the podcast, she's like, yeah, I was responsible for 54%, and you were responsible for the other, 60. I'm going to suck at doing math right now. Whatever. It's 46%. And so, she's really calculating it as like, oh, I was responsible for this much and you were responsible for that much. And she expects him to apologize for his share as she calculates it. And so needless to say, we don't always do the same math. We're all apology challenged with certain people and in some situations. Some apologies are easier than others. It's one thing to forget to return your neighbor's Tupperware and another to sleep with her husband. For a small insensitivity, a simple and heartfelt I'm sorry may be all it takes. But not all of our insensitivities are simple. This book will teach you how to craft a deeply meaningful apology and decode apologies that are blame-reversing, ambiguous, and downright mean. I've gotten a few of those in my life. Going beyond the how-tos of the good apology, we'll be looking at compelling stories that illustrate how much the simple apology matters and why we so often muck it up. We'll also be looking at heroic apologies that can open the door to forgiveness and healing, even the most difficult circumstances. As the title, Why Won't You Apologize, suggests, the chapters ahead are also for the hurt or angry person who's received a weaselly or insincere apology, or none at all. When we've been insulted or injured by someone who just doesn't get it, we can learn the steps necessary to change the tone of the conversation and get through. Other times, however, nothing we say or do will change the unrepentant wrongdoer. In fact, the more serious the harm, the less likely it is for the wrongdoer to feel genuine remorse and make amends. What does the hurt party do then? The challenge of apology and reconciliation is a dance that occurs between at least two people. We are all many times over on both sides of the equation. Let's begin with a brief sorry sampler. Sorries that go from easy to medium to hard. Okay, the simplest I'm sorry. The simplest I'm sorry, the one easiest to offer, is when nothing is anybody's fault. We say these words not as an apology, but rather as an empathic response to another person's pain. I'm so sorry you have to go through this ordeal. Or to a situation that has inconvenienced them. I'm sorry, I'm late. An accident on the interstate tied up the traffic. Here, I'm sorry recognizes the other person was put out or going through a difficult time, and we want to communicate that we care. In many situations, I'm sorry requires relatively little effort, but the failure to extend it is not a small omission. Life is hard, and even the briefest of interactions with strangers can brighten your day or haunt it. It's not that you're going to sink into a major depression because the woman in the grocery store nearly ran you down with her cart and rushed off without even looking up. You might assume that she failed to apologize because she didn't care, or alternatively, that she was too preoccupied or overcome with shame to make eye contact and speak. Whatever her reasons, it just doesn't feel good, and the not good feelings hangs on. Sometimes the failure of the other person to apologize when they should hits us harder than the deed that they should apologize for. Okay, this is titled The Long Wait in the Examining Room. When the relationship matters, the failure to say, I'm sorry, can erode connection, even when it's clear to both parties that no one is responsible for behaving badly. Consider my therapy client, Yolanda, who sat clothed in a skimpy hospital gown on a cold table in the examining room, waiting for her doctor, who was nearly an hour late. So my doctor finally appears. Yolanda tells me, obviously upset, and she says nothing, not even a simple apology. I felt like I wasn't even a person to her. And later, I felt bad about myself for being so oversensitive. Questioning ourselves for being oversensitive is a common way that women, in particular, disqualify our legitimate anger and hurt. If you've hung out in medical examining rooms, you know that patients feel vulnerable. The fact that some of us feel more vulnerable than others in a particular context does not mean that we are weak or lesser in any way. Yolanda didn't take the long wait personally. She didn't suspect that her physician was hiding out playing video games or texting her friends. Yolanda simply wanted to hear, I'm sorry you had to wait so long. My last patient required more time than I had scheduled. The failure of Yolanda's doctor to even comment on her lateness felt like a small crack in the relationship with somebody on whom she profoundly depends. A simple I'm sorry would have allowed Yolanda to feel respected, cared for, and validated. Okay, a medium difficult I'm sorry. An apology is more difficult to offer when we do have something to apologize for and we regret our earlier behavior. Here, even a short, sweet, and belated apology can sometimes matter a great deal. Deborah, a therapy client of mine, missed her younger sister's wedding because it conflicted with a professional conference where she was presenting a paper. The conference had been scheduled long before her sister Sky decided on her wedding date, and Deborah was angry with her sister for expecting her to be there and for insisting that the date she chose to marry was the only one that worked. I might have done this to a friend. Okay. But on the day of the wedding, Deborah felt awful about the choice that she'd made and wished she were with her family at such an important time. Though they moved on, the incident rankled both of them. At first, Deborah had no intention of apologizing to Sky. For one thing, she thought Sky should offer the apology. There was no excuse. Deborah told me for announcing the wedding date as a done deal, rather than for factoring Deborah's schedule into the equation. Later, after feeling like she'd made a colossal mistake in choosing to be at the conference, Deborah didn't want to reopen the issue for a different reason. Apologizing, she believed, would only amplify the issue and make them both feel worse. Years later, in a flash of sudden affection for her sister, Deborah spontaneously sent Sky an email that said, I've never told you how bad I felt about missing your wedding and how sorry I am about my decision. The day I was giving my paper at the conference, I kept thinking to myself, what am I doing here? I have no explanation or excuse for making Such a stupid decision. Her sister wrote back, yeah, Deb, you were a real asshole. Email is generally not a good way to offer an apology. In this case, however, Deborah told me how everything felt lighter between them after this exchange. It's like some bit of trust or closeness had been restored, and I didn't even know it was missing. I did this to my best friend, my high school best friend. I was working at a job in New York State, and I was taking kids on backpacking trips and sailing trips and rock climbing trips and missed her wedding. And I did not apologize. I could imagine sending her an apology or just calling her, actually, considering that, as she says, email is not the best. Okay. Jumping off the high dive, the toughest apologies. It can take great courage to open a conversation and apologize for something we wish we'd handled differently in the past. Perhaps we don't want to be intrusive, or we're concerned about how our apology will be received and what would happen next. If the other person hadn't brought the subject up, we may assume that we shouldn't either. But as Margaret's story illustrates, it's best to leave open the possibility of talking about our earlier behavior that we now regret. Margaret has a daughter, Eleanor, a single mother whose second child, Christian, died when he was 16 days old, having never left the hospital. Margaret had been hopeful in practical ways, taking care of Eleanor's 3-year-old son and keeping up the household during the 2 weeks Eleanor practically lived in the hospital. Margaret was absent, however, at the emotional level. In true British fashion, she had a no mess, no fuss attitude towards life's difficulties and a long cultural tradition of don't fret, plod on. She loved her daughter enormously, but she didn't want Eleanor to get bogged down in grief, and she also wanted to avoid her own deep sorrow. Out of her wish to protect both Eleanor and herself, Margaret failed to express her pain or inquire how her daughter was doing with this profound loss. The few times she saw Eleanor crying or depressed, she said things like, "Your son needs you. Be strong for him." A decade later, Margaret's co-worker and friend George, who had a son who was stillborn. His loss understandably brought up Margaret's own buried feelings of grief about her grandson Christian and the life he never had. When she observed the tremendous outpouring of love that George received and the open-hearted way that he embraced the caring that surrounded him, something shifted in Margaret. She asked herself for the first time if she had done well by her daughter in the way that she had responded to Christian's tragic death. Soon thereafter, a newspaper article about untimely loss appeared on the front page of their local paper. Much to her own surprise, Margaret revved up her courage and asked Eleanor if she'd read the piece. She also told her that she thought about Christian all of the time. Margaret went on to say that she regretted never talking about her feelings because she didn't know what to say and was afraid of making Eleanor feel worse. She said she was sorry that she'd not made a space for them to talk about something so important, the saddest thing that had ever happened in their lives. Eleanor's initial response was predictable. "There's nothing you could have done," she said flatly. "It wasn't something you could fix. Don't worry about it." Eleanor was very much her mother's daughter. Often the most interesting part of an apology is what happens later. Neither brought the subject up again, but Margaret told me that after the initial awkwardness passed, she felt better about having spoken up. Months later, as the anniversary of Christian's death was approaching, Margaret felt the desire to bring flowers to Christian's grave. She hadn't been there since the funeral. She casually mentioned this to Eleanor, who matter-of-factly replied that she planned to make the trip, and they could go together if Margaret wanted a ride. Only on the ride to the cemetery did Margaret learn that Eleanor had been to the graveside twice a year for the past 7 years. As they stood by Christian's small gravestone, Margaret suddenly started sobbing. This surge of emotion took her totally by surprise because she had never cried about Christian's death, and hardly ever about anything else. More unexpected still, Eleanor put her arms around her mother and they cried together. In Margaret's case, her apology felt like a great risk. She had been raised in a family where cheerfulness was one of the few permissible emotions. Competence and independence, defined as not needing anybody, were next to godliness. Her apology required her to share vulnerability and take a big leap into the unknown. She had no role model from her past to look to as a guide, so pioneering a new path required great courage on her part. I don't know about you, but as I read through this, I'm thinking of a lot of apologies. It's like, oh yeah, that, oh yeah, that, oh, ooh, that one. All right. It's inspiring. I'm like, oh, I want to reach out to this person, reach out to that person. Okay. Beyond the how-tos, there are, of course, far more difficult situations in which to apologize than Margaret's. For example, we may be faced with a person who wants us to apologize and we don't think we should. It's a profound challenge to sit on the hot seat and listen with an open heart to the hurt and anger of the wounded person who wants us to be sorry, especially when that person is accusing us, and not accurately as we see it, of causing their pain. Yet both personal integrity and success in relationships depend on our ability to take responsibility for our part and only our part, even when the other person is being a jerk. In the following chapters, we'll take a fresh look at the power and potential pitfalls of apologies. For example, why is it so difficult for humans to offer clear expressions of responsibility and remorse for our hurtful words and actions? What drives the non-apologizer and the female over-apologizer? Why are the people who do the worst things the least able to own up? How do we sort out who is responsible for what? I got funny shadows on my face. Maybe I can find a good angle here. Okay, how do we, the hurt party, unwittingly contribute to the other person's defensiveness and refusal to apologize? Ooh. Okay, how can we get past life-draining anger and bitterness when the wrongdoer distorts reality or reverses blame? What's the real reason you can't stop hating your ex, whomever? Perhaps the most painful issue in the apology lexicon is coming to terms with the non-repentant wrongdoer. This is a universal human challenge for which forgiveness is the prescribed solution of the day. Yet as we'll see, you do not need to forgive the person who has hurt you in order to free yourself from obsessive anger and bitterness. Indeed, sometimes you have to be brave enough to resist pressure from the forgiveness cops. The need for apologies and repair is a singularly human one, both on the giving and receiving ends. We are hardwired to seek justice and fairness, however we see it. So the need to receive a sincere apology that is due is deeply felt. We are also imperfect human beings and prone to error and defensiveness. So the challenge of offering a heartfelt apology permeates almost every relationship. We take turns at being the offender and the offended until our very last breath. Oh, I just love the honesty of that, of like, yeah, this is going to keep happening. We take turns at being the offender and the offended until our very last breath. It's reassuring to know that we have the possibility to set things right, or at least to know that we have brought our best selves to the task at hand, however the person responds.